Imagine stepping back in time to the 1770s. The air in the 13 American colonies crackles with a strange energy. It's a mix of frustration, a deep-seated feeling of injustice, and a thrilling, dangerous whisper of something new. Independence. This wasn't just a sudden whim. For over a century and a half, these colonies had been carving out a life on the edge of a vast, untamed continent, thousands of miles from the heart of the British Empire. They were forging a new identity, one that was distinctly American. Life here was a paradox. On one hand, colonists were subjects of the most powerful empire on earth, the British Empire. They drank British tea, read British books, and, in theory, enjoyed the rights of Englishmen. On the other hand, the vast Atlantic Ocean acted as a natural barrier, creating a sense of separation and self. Decisions from London took months to arrive, forcing colonists to govern themselves, to solve their own problems, and to build their own communities from the ground up. They had their own legislatures, their own local militias, and a fierce pride in what they had built. But in the 1760s and 70s, the relationship began to sour. After the costly 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, Britain was deep in debt. King George III and his parliament looked to the colonies as a source of revenue. Suddenly, a wave of new taxes and laws washed over America, all passed without any colonial representatives in Parliament. First came the Stamp Act in 1765, taxing everything from legal documents to playing cards. Colonists were outraged. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry, echoing from the bustling ports of Boston to the rural farms of Virginia. The British government, instead of listening, doubled down. They sent more troops, enacted more laws like the Townshend Acts and the infamous Intolerable Acts, which closed the port of Boston and stripped Massachusetts of its self-governance. The presence of red-coated soldiers on the streets of their own cities felt like an occupation. It was a constant, visual reminder that they were being treated not as equals, but as subordinates. The feeling of being a proud Englishman was fading, replaced by the sting of being a second-class subject. This growing resentment wasn't confined to the halls of colonial assemblies. It was discussed in taverns over mugs of ale, preached from church pulpits, and debated in pamphlets that spread like wildfire. Men like Samuel Adams in Boston, Patrick Henry in Virginia, and Thomas Paine, a recent immigrant, began to articulate what many were feeling. They weren't just arguing about taxes anymore. They were questioning the very nature of government and the fundamental rights of man. They spoke of liberty, of self-determination, and of a future where Americans governed themselves. Imagine the scene. A blacksmith in Philadelphia, wiping sweat from his brow, listening as a neighbor reads from Paine's Common Sense. The words are electric, arguing that it's absurd for a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. Or picture a group of women in North Carolina, organizing boycotts of British goods, spinning their own cloth to protest the unjust taxes. This was a movement that touched every corner of society. The whispers of independence were growing louder, becoming a determined murmur, a chorus of voices yearning for freedom. This wasn't a desire for chaos. It was a yearning for control over their own destiny. They had tamed a wilderness, built thriving cities, and developed a unique way of life. They believed they had earned the right to govern themselves. The colonies were like a child who had grown into adulthood, ready to leave their parents' home and make their own way in the world. The king and parliament, however, still saw them as dependents, to be controlled and commanded. This fundamental misunderstanding set the stage for a monumental clash. The air was thick with tension. The smell of salt and tar in the port cities mingled with the scent of rebellion. Every new tax, every new shipload of British soldiers, pushed the colonies further down a path from which there would be no return. They were standing on a precipice, looking out at an uncertain future. Behind them lay the security of the British Empire. Before them, the perilous, unwritten promise of a new nation conceived in liberty. The 1770s were more than just a decade of protest. They were the crucible in which the United States of America was forged. A nation was awakening, and the world would never be the same. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey back in time. If you found this chapter of history as fascinating as we do, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories that shaped our world. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. See you then. Welcome back to our journey through the American Revolution. Last time, we explored the simmering tensions in the colonies. Today, in Chapter 2, Seeds of Rebellion, we're diving deep into the events that ignited the flames of defiance. How did 13 separate colonies, each with its own identity, begin to see themselves as one? It started with a piece of paper and a powerful idea. Imagine this. It's 1765. You're a colonist, maybe a printer in Philadelphia, or a lawyer in Boston. Life is hard, but it's your life. Then one day, the British Parliament, an ocean away, passes something called the Stamp Act. Suddenly, almost every piece of paper you use requires a special stamp, and that stamp costs money. We're talking newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, even diplomas. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a direct tax imposed on your daily life by a government in which you had no voice. This is where a simple, yet earth-shattering phrase began to echo through the streets. No taxation without representation. It wasn't just about the money, it was about a fundamental principle. For generations, colonists had cherished their rights as Englishmen, which included the right to be taxed only by their own elected representatives. The Stamp Act felt like a betrayal of that core value. It was seen as Parliament treating them not as subjects with rights, but as a source of revenue to pay off Britain's war debts. The reaction was swift and furious. Protests erupted across the colonies. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods, hitting the British economy where it hurt. Groups like the Sons of Liberty formed, using demonstrations and sometimes intimidation to prevent the stamps from ever being sold. Think about the unity this created. A ship captain in Charleston, a farmer in Massachusetts, a merchant in New York, they were all facing the same tax, all feeling the same injustice. For the first time, they were united by a common enemy and a common cause. The pressure was so intense that Parliament, stunned by the unified resistance, repealed the Stamp Act just 1 year later. This was a massive victory for the colonists. It proved that when they stood together, they had power. It was a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. But the calm didn't last long. While Parliament backed down on the Stamp Act, they weren't giving up on the principle. They passed a declaratory act, basically saying, we repealed the tax, but we still have the right to tax you whenever we want. The underlying conflict was far from over. Fast forward a few years to 1773. The British government is still trying to assert its authority and raise money from the colonies. This time, their plan centers on tea. The British East India Company was struggling financially, and Parliament decided to help it out with the Tea Act. This act didn't impose a new tax. Instead, it gave the company a monopoly, allowing it to sell its tea directly to the colonies at a price so low it would undercut even smuggled Dutch tea. On the surface, cheaper tea might sound like a good deal, but the colonists saw the trap. The Tea Act kept a small, symbolic tax on tea from the earlier Townshend Acts. Buying this cheap tea, even though it was a bargain, meant implicitly accepting Parliament's right to tax them. It was a clever attempt to trick them into giving up their principles for a good price. Samuel Adams, a leading voice of rebellion in Boston, called it a poisoned gift. The colonists weren't fooled. They saw it as another attempt to enforce taxation without representation, just wrapped in a more appealing package. When the tea ships arrived in various colonial ports, they were met with organized resistance. In Charleston, the tea was impounded. In Philadelphia and New York, the ships were forced to turn back to England without unloading their cargo. But in Boston, the royal governor, Thomas Jefferson, was determined to see the tea unloaded and the tax paid. He refused to let the ships leave the harbor. This created a tense standoff. For weeks, Bostonians held meetings, demanding the ships be sent back. The deadline for paying the tax was fast approaching. On the night of December 16, 1773, a massive town meeting was held at the Old South Meeting House. After learning the governor would not budge, Samuel Adams stood up and declared, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." This was the signal. As if on cue, a group of men, disguised as Mohawk Indians to conceal their identities, emerged from the crowd and headed for Griffin's Wharf. They were members of the Sons of Liberty. In the cold night air, they boarded the 3T, ships the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Working silently and efficiently, they hoisted 342 chests of tea from the holds and smashed them open, dumping the contents into the Boston harbor. The value of the destroyed tea was immense, equivalent to over $1 million today. This audacious act, which we now call the Boston Tea Party, was not a drunken riot. It was a carefully planned act of political protest. It was a dramatic, unmistakable message sent across the Atlantic. We will not be governed by a body that does not represent us. We will not surrender our rights. The destruction of private property was a radical step, and it shocked people on both sides of the Atlantic. The seeds of rebellion had been sown with the Stamp Act, watered by years of smaller grievances, and had now sprouted into open defiance with the Boston Tea Party. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," was no longer just a complaint. It was a rallying cry for action. These events forged a sense of shared identity and purpose among the colonists. They were beginning to see themselves, not just as Virginians or New Yorkers, but as Americans, united in a struggle for liberty. The British response to the Boston Tea Party would be severe and punitive, pushing the colonies even closer to the brink of war. We'll explore that explosive reaction in our next chapter. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into American history. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. See you in the next chapter. Welcome back to our series on the American Revolution. Last time, we saw the colonies starting to push back against British rule. Today, we're diving into Chapter 3. Britain tightens its grip. Spoiler alert. Things are about to get intense. So, how did King George III and the British Parliament react to all this colonial defiance, like the Boston Tea Party? Well, they weren't exactly thrilled. Instead of backing down or seeking a peaceful compromise, they decided to double down. Their message was clear. The colonies will obey. Imagine being King George III for a moment. You're the ruler of a vast, powerful empire. You've just fought an expensive war. 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as it was known in America partly, to protect these very colonies. Now, you're deep in debt, and you think it's only fair that the colonists help pay for their own defense. Makes sense from his perspective, right? So, Parliament starts rolling out a series of new laws and taxes. We're not just talking about a small price hike on tea anymore. These were measures designed to assert British authority once and for all. They saw the colonists' protests not as a legitimate grievance, but as an outright rebellion that needed to be crushed. One of the first things they did was increase the military presence. More and more British soldiers, known as redcoats because of their bright red uniforms, were sent to the colonies. Their primary station, the heart of the rebellion, Boston, Massachusetts. Now, having a foreign army stationed in your city during peacetime was a huge point of contention. The Quartering Act forced colonists to house and feed these soldiers in their own homes. Can you imagine a strange soldier living in your house, eating your food, and you have no say in the matter? It felt like a constant, invasive reminder of who was in charge. Tensions in Boston were already simmering, and this just turned up the heat. This military buildup inevitably led to clashes. The most famous was the Boston Massacre in 1770. A street brawl between a mob of colonists and a squad of British soldiers escalated tragically. The soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 5 colonists. Patriots like Paul Revere immediately seized on the event, creating powerful propaganda that depicted a brutal slaughter of innocent citizens. Whether it was a massacre or a riot that got out of hand, it didn't matter. In the court of public opinion, Britain was the villain. But the real turning point, the action that pushed the colonies to the brink, came in response to the Boston Tea Party. When Bostonians dumped a fortune's worth of tea into the harbor, Parliament's reaction was swift and severe. They passed a series of punitive laws in 1774 that the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. And trust me, they were named that for a reason. Let's break them down. First, the Boston Port Act. This completely shut down Boston Harbor to all trade, in or out. The port would remain closed until the city paid for the destroyed tea. This was an economic death sentence for a city that relied on maritime commerce. Businesses failed, sailors were out of work, and families struggled to get basic supplies. The goal was to starve Boston into submission. Next was the Massachusetts Government Act. This one basically stripped Massachusetts of its self-government. The colonists' locally elected assembly was all but dissolved. From now on, the governor, who was appointed by the king, would have almost absolute power. Town meetings, which were the bedrock of local democracy, could now only happen with the governor's permission. This was a direct assault on their political freedom. Then came the Administration of Justice Act. This law allowed British officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be sent back to Britain for trial. The colonists called it the Murder Act because they believed it would allow British soldiers and officials to get away with anything, knowing they'd face a sympathetic jury back home instead of a colonial one. And finally, a new, tougher quartering act was passed, making it even easier for the military to house soldiers in private homes and buildings. Parliament thought these intolerable acts would isolate and punish Boston, making an example out of them. They believed the other colonies would see what happened and fall back in line, too scared to cause any more trouble. But they miscalculated. Big time. Instead of isolating Boston, the intolerable acts did the exact opposite. The other colonies looked at what was happening in Massachusetts and thought, if they can do that to Boston, they can do it to us next. A sense of solidarity swept through the colonies. Food and supplies poured into Boston from places as far away as South Carolina. The punishment intended to divide them actually united them like never before. The message was no longer just about taxes. It was about fundamental rights. The right to trade freely, the right to self-government, the right to a fair trial. Britain wasn't just trying to tax them. It was trying to control every aspect of their lives. In response to these acts, the colonies decided to take a momentous step. They organized the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in the fall of 1774. Delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, all except Georgia, came together to figure out a coordinated response. This was a huge deal. They weren't just 13 separate entities anymore. They were starting to act as one. At the Congress, they agreed to a full boycott of British goods and began to organize They weren't declaring independence just yet. Many still hoped for a peaceful resolution. But they sent a petition to King George III, outlining their grievances and asserting their rights as British citizens. They were drawing a line in the sand. So, as we close this chapter, the stage is set for a dramatic confrontation. Britain has tightened its grip, but in doing so, has squeezed the colonies together. The intolerable acts, meant to enforce obedience, instead ignited a fire of resistance that would soon engulf the entire continent. The talk was no longer just of protests, but of liberty or death. What happens next? You'll have to join us for Chapter 4, where the first shots of the war are finally fired. Thanks so much for watching. If you're enjoying this journey through history, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next episode. We love hearing from you, so drop your thoughts and questions in the comments below. See you next time. Hello history buffs, and welcome back to our series on the American Revolution. Last time, we talked about the growing unrest in the colonies, culminating in the Boston Tea Party and Britain's harsh response with the intolerable acts. The colonists realized they couldn't face this threat alone. It was time to unite. So, in September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. This meeting, held in Carpenter's Hall, would become known as the First Continental Congress. Imagine the scene. 56 men, strangers for the most part, coming together with a shared sense of crisis, but very different ideas on how to solve it. Georgia was the only colony that didn't send a delegate. They were dealing with their own conflicts and were hesitant to anger the British Crown, which they relied on for protection. Among the delegates were some of the most brilliant minds of the era. From Massachusetts came the fiery and passionate lawyer, John Adams, a staunch advocate for colonial rights. His cousin, Samuel Adams, the master organizer and agitator, was also there. Virginia sent a powerful delegation, including the eloquent and radical Patrick Henry, who famously declared, "The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American. And then there was a quiet, towering figure, a veteran of the French and Indian War, who attended in his military uniform. This was Colonel George Washington. His presence was a silent but powerful statement. He was ready for a fight if it came to that. Benjamin Franklin, at this point, was still in London, trying to negotiate with the British government, but his influence was felt through his writings and correspondence. The main debate during this first Congress was how to respond to the intolerable acts. Should they seek reconciliation with Britain, or should they prepare for a more drastic break? The delegates were divided. Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania proposed a plan for an American colonial parliament that would work alongside the British Parliament, a sort of compromise. But the more radical voices, led by the Adams cousins and Patrick Henry, argued for a stronger stance. Ultimately, the radicals won the day. The Congress issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which affirmed their loyalty to the Crown, but also insisted on their rights as British subjects, including the right to not be taxed without their own consent. More importantly, they created the Continental Association, a pact to boycott all British goods. They agreed to stop importing from Britain, stop consuming British products, and eventually stop exporting their own goods to Britain if the Intolerance Acts were not repealed. This was economic warfare on a massive scale. Before adjourning in October 1774, they made a crucial decision. They would meet again in May of the following year if their grievances were not addressed. It was a clear signal to London that the colonies were serious and united. King George III and Parliament, however, were not impressed. They saw this as an act of rebellion and declared Massachusetts to be in a state of open revolt. More troops were sent to America. As you can guess, things didn't get better. On April 19, 1775, before the next Congress could even convene, the shot heard round the world was fired at Lexington and the war had begun. So, when the Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia in May 1775, the atmosphere was completely different. The debate was no longer just about boycotts and petitions. Now, they were at war. The delegates met in the Pennsylvania State House, which we now know as Independence Hall. This time, all 13 colonies were represented. The new faces in this Congress were just as remarkable. Benjamin Franklin was back from London, his hopes for reconciliation dashed. He was now fully committed to the colonial cause. And from Virginia came a young, brilliant, and remarkably quiet lawyer named Thomas Jefferson. Though he rarely spoke in public debates, his power with the pen would soon change the world. The most urgent task for the Second Continental Congress was to organize the war effort. The militia that had fought at Lexington and Concord and surrounded Boston was a disorganized mix of local groups. They needed a proper army and a commander. Who could possibly lead such a force? The choice fell, almost unanimously, on the man who had shown up to the first Congress in his military uniform, George Washington. John Adams, recognizing the need to unite the colonies, nominated Washington. Appointing a Virginian to lead an army composed mostly of New Englanders was a masterful political move. It showed that this was not just a Massachusetts fight, but an American one. On June 15, 1775, Congress appointed Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the new Continental Army. Washington, ever humble, accepted the position but famously refused to take a salary, asking only that his expenses be covered. With an army and a general, the Congress essentially became the de facto government of the colonies. They started printing money, called Continentals, to pay for the war. They created a postal service and appointed Benjamin Franklin as the first postmaster general. They also established committees to handle foreign relations, hoping to secure aid from Britain's enemies, particularly France. Even as they managed a war, many delegates still hoped for a peaceful resolution. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, a leading voice for moderation, drafted the Olive Branch Petition. It was a final appeal to King George III, professing their loyalty and begging him to prevent further conflict. They sent it to London in July 1775. But it was too little, too late. King George refused to even read the petition. Instead, in August, he issued the Proclamation of Rebellion, formally declaring the colonies to be in a state of open and avowed rebellion. He called on all loyal subjects to help suppress this uprising. For many colonists, this was the final straw. The king, who they had hoped would be their protector, had now declared war on them. The Second Continental Congress would remain in session for years, guiding the colonies through the long and difficult war. They would face incredible challenges: a lack of funding, desertions in the army, and intense political disagreements. But it was this body, born out of crisis, that would take the monumental step of declaring independence from Great Britain, a topic we will explore in our very next chapter. The gathering of the Continental Congress was a pivotal moment. It was where 13 separate colonies began to think and act as a single nation, where leaders like Washington, Adams, and Jefferson first stepped onto the national stage, and where the fight for rights transformed into a fight for a new country. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through American history. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next episode where we dive into the Declaration of Independence. See you next time. Hello history lovers, and welcome back. Last time, we explored the simmering tensions that brought the American colonies to a boiling point. Today, we dive into the moment that spark finally ignited the flames of war. This is the story of the battles of Lexington and the shot heard round the world. The year is 1775. The air in Massachusetts is thick with defiance, after years of escalating conflict from the Stamp Act to the Boston Tea Party and the intolerable acts the colony as a powder keg. British troops occupy Boston, a constant, red-coated reminder of the Crown's authority. But outside the city, the countryside is stirring. Colonists, calling themselves patriots, have been secretly organizing, training militias, and stockpiling weapons and supplies. They are preparing for a fight they hope will never come, but which they feel is increasingly inevitable. The British commander in Boston, General Thomas Jefferson, is in a tough spot. He's under immense pressure from London to crush this rebellion before it gets out of hand. His spies have been busy, and they bring him crucial intelligence. A major cache of Patriot arms and ammunition is hidden in the town of Concord, about 20 miles northwest of Boston. Even more enticing, two key leaders of the Patriot movement, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, are reportedly staying in the nearby town of Lexington. Gage sees an opportunity to deliver a decisive blow. He plans a swift, secret mission, march to Concord, seize the supplies, and, if possible, arrest Adams and Hancock along the way. He believes a show of force will intimidate the colonists into submission. Oh, how wrong he would be. The plan was set for the night of April 18, 1775. Under the cloak of darkness, around 700 of Gage's elite troops, the Grenadiers and light infantry, were to slip out of Boston. They would cross the Charles River by boat and then march quickly through the countryside, hoping to catch the colonists completely by surprise. Secrecy was paramount. But in a city buzzing with spies and revolutionary sentiment, secrets are hard to keep. The Patriots had their own intelligence network, the Sons of Liberty. They were watching every move the British made. Dr. Joseph Warren, a key leader of the resistance in Boston, got wind of the British plan. He knew he had to act fast. He summoned two riders, a silversmith named Paul Revere and a tanner named William Dawes. Their mission was one of the most famous in American history. Ride with all speed to Lexington and Concord to warn Adams, Hancock, and the local militias that the British were coming. To ensure the message got through, they set up a signal system. One lantern in the steeple of the Old North Church would mean the British were marching by land over the narrow strip connecting Boston to the mainland. Two lanterns would signal they were coming by sea, crossing the Charles River. As Revere waited, two lights flickered to life in the belt. The British were on the move by water. Revere was rowed silently across the river, right under the nose of a British warship, the HMS Somerset. Once on the other side, he mounted a horse and began his legendary midnight ride. The regulars are coming out. This was the cry that echoed through the Massachusetts countryside. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and later, a doctor named Samuel Prescott, galloped through the night, waking up Minutemen special militia members who had sworn to be ready to fight at a minute's notice. Every cottage, farm, and village they passed was alerted. Church bells began to peal, and signal fires were lit on hilltops, spreading the alarm like a chain reaction. The secret British mission was no longer a secret. The element of surprise was lost. As dawn broke on April 19th, the British vanguard, led by Major John Pitcairn, marched into the town of Lexington. They were exhausted and on edge after their night march. Waiting for them on the village green was a small group of about 77 colonial militiamen, led by Captain John Parker. Parker wasn't looking for a battle. He knew his small force was no match for the British regulars. Accounts say he told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Major Pitcairn rode forward and ordered the colonists to disperse. "Lay down your arms, you villains, you rebels," he shouted. There was confusion, shouting from both sides. Captain Parker, seeing the situation was hopeless, ordered his men to fall back. But as they began to move, a single gunshot rang out. To this day, no one knows for certain who fired that first shot. Was it a nervous militiaman? A trigger-happy British soldier? A shot from a bystander behind a wall? It doesn't matter. That one shot shattered the morning calm and changed the course of history. Immediately, the British troops, without orders, unleashed a devastating volley of musket fire into the militia's ranks. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead on Lexington Green, and 10 more were wounded. The British had suffered only one minor injury. The American Revolution had begun with a massacre. The British regulars quickly reformed their lines and continued their march toward their primary objective, but the alarm had been thoroughly spread. When the British troops reached Concord around 8 a.m., they found that the Patriots had already moved most of the military supplies. Frustrated, the soldiers began to search the town. They found and destroyed a few cannons, some flour, and threw musket balls into the town pond. While a small contingent of British troops secured the North Bridge on the edge of town, the main force conducted their search. Meanwhile, on the hills overlooking Concord, the number of Patriot militiamen was swelling. Minutemen and militia from Concord, Acton, Lincoln, and other surrounding towns were pouring in, drawn by the news from Lexington. They watched as smoke began to rise from the center of town. The British were burning some of the supplies they had found, and the colonists feared the soldiers were burning their homes. This was the final straw. Colonel James Barrett gave the order to advance. The militia, now numbering around 400, marched down the hill toward the North Bridge, which was held by about 100 British soldiers. The Acton Militia Company led the way, with their fifer playing the White Cockade, a popular tune. As the Americans approached, the British fired a few warning shots, then a full volley. The shots hit and killed Captain Isaac Davis and another Minuteman from Acton. This time, the colonists didn't hesitate. Major John Buttrick of Concord yelled the order. "Fire, fellow soldiers! For God's sake, fire!" The militia unleashed a disciplined and concentrated volley. The British, outnumbered and shocked by the organized resistance, broke and fled back toward the main force in town. It was a stunning moment. A group of farmers and artisans had just forced a contingent of the world's most professional army to retreat. The British commander, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, realized his mission was a failure and the situation was becoming dangerous. The countryside was swarming with angry colonists. He gave the order to begin the long 18-mile march back to Boston, and that's when the day turned into a nightmare for the British. This wasn't a conventional battle. The march back became a running 80-mile gauntlet of guerrilla warfare. Thousands of militiamen, now enraged by the news from Lexington, converged on the road. They didn't line up in open fields. They fought from behind stone walls, trees, houses, and barns. They fired on the long, exposed column of redcoats, then melted back into the landscape, reloaded, and ran ahead to attack again from a new position. The British soldiers were exhausted, terrified, and taking casualties from an enemy they could barely see. Their orderly march disintegrated into a panicked retreat. Ammunition was running low. Colonel Smith himself was wounded. The entire column was on the verge of collapse and complete surrender. Just in the nick of time, as the retreating soldiers reached the outskirts of Lexington, they were met by a relief column of 1,000 fresh British troops and 2 cannons, led by Lord Hugh Percy. This rescue force provided a crucial screen, allowing the battered remnants of the original column to rest and regroup. But the respite was brief. As soon as they resumed the march, the attacks started again, and continued all the way to Charlestown, just across the river from Boston. By the time the sun set on April 19, 1775, the exhausted British troops finally reached the safety of the city, under the protection of the Royal Navy's guns. The day had been a complete disaster for them. They had suffered nearly 300 casualties killed, wounded, or missing. The Patriots, by contrast, had fewer than 100. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The real impact was psychological and political. The British had set out on a secret mission to intimidate the colonists and seize their weapons. They had failed on all counts. Instead of crushing the rebellion, their actions had fanned it into a raging fire. News of the battles spread like wildfire throughout the 13 colonies. The story of farmers standing up to the mighty British army, of the shot heard round the world, became a powerful, rallying cry. Lexington and Concord proved that the American colonists were not just a disorganized rabble. They were willing and able to fight and die for their rights and their freedom. It showed that the disciplined British regulars were not invincible, especially when faced with an unconventional, determined foe fighting on their home turf. In the days that followed, thousands of militiamen from all over New England marched to Boston, surrounding the city and trapping the British army inside. The standoff, known as the Siege of Boston, had begun. The colonies were now united in armed opposition to the Crown. Compromise seemed impossible. War, which had once been a dreadful possibility, was now a grim reality. The spark of Lexington and Concord had ignited the American Revolutionary War. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the events of that fateful day. It's a powerful story of courage and conviction. If you found this chapter of history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll cover the Battle of Bunker Hill and the escalating conflict. As always, thanks for watching. Hello, history buffs, and welcome back to our series on the American Revolution. Last time, we talked about the first shots fired and the rising tensions between the colonies and Great Britain. But how did a series of protests and skirmishes turn into a full-blown demand for a new nation? That's what we're rediving into today. The pivotal moment when rebellion transformed into revolution. For a long time, most colonists didn't want to break away from Britain. They were proud British subjects who simply wanted their rights respected. They wanted representation, fair taxes, and to be treated as equals within the British Empire. The idea of completely severing ties with the mother country was radical, even scary. Too many. Imagine cutting yourself off from the most powerful empire in the world, with its established trade networks, military protection, and shared cultural heritage. It was a monumental leap into the unknown. Colonial leaders like John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and even George Washington initially hoped for reconciliation. They sent petitions to King George III, like the Olive Branch petition, pleading for a peaceful resolution. They believed that if they could just make the king and parliament understand their perspective, they could fix the relationship. But with each passing month, as their pleas were ignored and more British troops arrived, that hope began to fade. The conflict was escalating, and a middle ground seemed to be disappearing. This is where the power of the written word changed everything. In January of 1776, a man named Thomas Paine published a short pamphlet that would act like a lightning bolt across the 13 colonies. It was Cahiers, Common Sense. And folks, it wasn't written for the fancy, powdered wig elites. Paine wrote in simple, direct, and powerful language that any farmer, artisan, or shopkeeper could understand. He wasn't interested in complex legal arguments. He was making a moral and emotional case for independence. Paine's arguments were revolutionary. He attacked the very idea of a monarchy and hereditary rule. He asked, why should a king, who got his power simply by being born into the right family, rule over an entire continent of people an ocean away? He called it absurd. He famously wrote, there is something exceedingly ridiculous in the composition of monarchy. Argued that it was against natural law for a small island to govern a vast continent. It was, as he put it, common sense. Paine didn't just criticize the old system. He painted a thrilling picture of the future. He envisioned an independent America as a beacon of liberty for the entire world, a place where people could govern themselves. free from the tyranny of a distant king. He wrote, "The cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind." This was a powerful idea. He was telling ordinary people that their struggle wasn't just about taxes. It was about creating a new kind of nation. A republic founded on the principles of freedom and self-government. The impact of Common Sense was staggering. It became an instant bestseller. It's estimated that over 100,000 copies were sold in just a few months. At a time when the entire colonial population was only about 2.5 million people, it was read aloud in taverns, in town squares, and in the camps of the Continental Army. It sparked conversations and debates everywhere. People who had been on the fence, unsure about what to do, were suddenly fired up with a passion for independence. Paine's pamphlet gave a voice to the unspoken thoughts of many colonists. It took the simmering anger and frustration and channeled it into a clear, unified goal: independence. It convinced many that reconciliation was not only impossible but undesirable. Why try to patch things up with a government that was inherently corrupt and oppressive? The only logical path forward, Paine argued, was to declare independence and build something new and better. This shift in public opinion was crucial. It put immense pressure on the delegates of the Second Continental Congress, who were meeting in Philadelphia. Before Common Sense, many delegates were still hesitant to take the final step, but now they were hearing from their constituents back home, who were energized by Paine's words and demanding a break from Britain. The call for independence was no longer coming just from a few radical leaders. It was becoming a roar from the people themselves. So, as we move towards the summer of 1776, remember the power of this little pamphlet. It demonstrates that revolutions aren't just fought with muskets and cannons. They're also fought with ideas and words. Thomas Paine, with his common sense, provided the intellectual and emotional fuel that turned a colonial rebellion into a full-fledged revolution, setting the stage for the creation of the United States of America. Next time we'll see how this newfound revolutionary spirit leads directly to one of the most important documents in human history, the Declaration of Independence. You won't want to miss it. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you then. Welcome back to our journey through the American Revolution. We've arrived at a pivotal moment, Chapter Siete, Voices of Freedom. The year is 1776, and the air in Philadelphia is thick with tension, not just from the summer heat, but from the fiery debates raging within the walls of the State House, now known as Independence Hall. The Continental Congress, a gathering of the brightest minds from the 13 colonies, faced a question that would define the course of history. Should they declare independence from Great Britain? This was not an easy decision. For over a century, these men had been subjects of the British Crown. To break away was to commit treason, an act punishable by death. It was a leap into the unknown, a gamble that could lead to utter ruin or to the birth of a new nation conceived in liberty. The delegates were torn. Their loyalties, their fears, and their hopes all clashed in a dramatic struggle for the future. On one side were the moderates, the cautious voices, men like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, known as the penman of the Revolution for his eloquent letters opposing British policies. Dickinson and his allies argued for reconciliation. They believed that the relationship with the mother country, though strained, could still be repaired. They feared the immense power of the British military and the chaos that a full-blown war would unleash. Was it not wiser, they argued, to seek a peaceful resolution, to petition the king one last time, and to avoid the bloodshed that seemed inevitable with a declaration of independence? They saw independence as a dangerous, final step, a door that once opened could never be closed. They urged patience, diplomacy, and a steady hand. Their plea was for stability, for order, and for the preservation of the society they knew. But on the other side, a powerful current of change was surging, and its most forceful advocate was a stout, often blonde lawyer from Massachusetts, John Adams. Adams was the driving force, the Atlas of independence. He had seen firsthand the escalating conflicts in Boston and believed that the time for talk was over. To him, reconciliation was a fantasy. He argued with tireless passion that King George III was a tyrant and that Parliament had trampled on the fundamental rights of the colonists. Adams believed that America was already independent in spirit and that it was time to make it a reality in law. Day after day, Adams stood before the Congress, his voice ringing with conviction. He countered every argument for delay, dismantled every plea for caution. He painted a vivid picture of a future where America was free to chart its own course, to trade with whomever it pleased, and to build a government based on the consent of the governed. He wasn't alone. He was supported by figures like the brilliant Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, the elder statesman Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, and the fiery Richard Henry Lee, also from Virginia. Lee would be the one to formally introduce the Resolution for Independence, stating boldly that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The debates were intense, often lasting from morning until dusk. Imagine the scene. Delegates in woolen coats, sweating in the summer humidity, arguing, pleading, and strategizing. Friendships were strained, and alliances were tested. Some delegates, representing colonies that had instructed them to vote against independence, felt trapped between their personal convictions and their duty to their constituents. The weight of an entire continent's future rested on their shoulders. Every word spoken, every argument made, echoed with historical significance. John Adams, in his letters to his wife Abigail, described the immense pressure. He wrote of the toil and blood and treasure that independence would cost, yet he never wavered in his belief that the prize liberty was worth any price. He worked relentlessly behind the scenes, persuading wavering delegates, building a coalition, and pushing, always pushing, towards the final vote. He understood that this was more than just a political maneuver. It was a moral imperative. It was about creating a new kind of nation, one where the people were sovereign. The moderate, like Dickinson, made powerful and heartfelt arguments. They weren't cowards. They were prudent men who loved America and feared for its safety. They saw the path to independence as a path to destruction, but the momentum was shifting. News from the battlefields, tales of British aggression, and the powerful words of Thomas Paine's common sense had swayed public opinion. The voices of freedom, led by the indomitable John Adams, were growing louder and more persuasive. The debate was no longer about asterisk, if asterisk they should declare independence, but asterisk when asterisk. The stage was set for a final, dramatic vote that would sever the ties with Great Britain forever and give birth to the United States of America. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into history. It is in these moments of intense debate and courageous decision-making that we truly understand the foundations of the world we live in today. If you enjoyed this chapter, please hit that like button and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. We'll see you in the next video. Welcome back to our series on the birth of a nation. We've seen the sparks of revolution, the heated debates, and the colonies inching closer to a momentous decision. But who would be the one to put their shared dream into words? Who would pen the document that would change the world? That task, as we'll see today, fell to a quiet, unassuming Virginian, Thomas Jefferson. Philadelphia, the summer of 1776. The air is thick, sticky with heat, buzzing not just with flies but with the electric energy of rebellion. Inside the Pennsylvania State House, the Second Continental Congress is a pressure cooker of ideas and arguments. They've decided to declare independence, but now they need a formal declaration. A committee of 5 is appointed. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson. Now, you might think the seasoned, fiery orator John Adams would be the natural choice to write it. He was the Atlas of independence, the man who had pushed and prodded the colonies toward this very moment. In fact, that's what most people expected. But Adams had other ideas. He knew the document needed more than just legal arguments and political theory. It needed eloquence, a soaring spirit, and a touch of the sublime. Adams later recalled turning to Jefferson. "You should do it," he said. Jefferson, ever modest, initially resisted. "Oh, no," he replied. "Why will you not? You ought to do it." Adams laid out his reasons, and they were brilliantly strategic. First, he argued, Jefferson was a Virginian, and a Virginian should be at the head of this business to unite the colonies. Massachusetts, Adams's home state, was already seen as the hotbed of radicalism. A Virginian author would lend the cause a broader appeal. Second, Adams admitted, "I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise." He knew his own passionate, often abrasive style had made him enemies. Jefferson, by contrast, was known for his calm demeanor and was generally well liked. But the most important reason was the third. Adams told Jefferson bluntly, "You can write 10 times better than I can." It was a moment of profound humility and insight from a man not always known for it. Adams recognized Jefferson's peculiar felicity of expression, his gift for language. He knew Jefferson could capture not just the logic, but the poetry of their cause. And so, the task fell to the 33-year-old Thomas Jefferson. He wasn't the loudest voice in Congress. In fact, he rarely spoke in the formal debates, preferring to work his influence in committees and through his prolific writing. He was a man of the Enlightenment, a polymath whose interests ranged from architecture and agriculture to philosophy and music. He was a quiet genius. Jefferson retreated to his rented rooms on the second floor of a brick house at 7th and Market Streets, owned by a bricklayer named Jacob Graff. Far from the noisy debates of the State House, he began his work. Imagine the scene. Jefferson, tall and slender with his reddish blonde hair, hunched over a portable writing desk of his own design. The Philadelphia summer heat is relentless. The windows are open, letting in the sounds of the city, the clatter of horse-drawn carts, the shouts of vendors. He didn't have a library of reference books to consult. He didn't need one. As he later explained, his goal wasn't to find out new principles or new arguments, never before thought of. Instead, he wanted to express the common sense of the subject, to place before mankind the justification for their actions in terms that were plain and firm. He was drawing from a deep well of ideas he had been studying his entire life from English thinkers like John Locke, who wrote about natural rights, and from the philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment. For 17 long days and nights, he wrote, revised, and wrote again. He chose his words with the precision of a watchmaker. He didn't just write that the colonies were breaking away. He framed it as a universal human struggle for freedom. He wasn't just listing grievances against King George III. He was building a legal and moral case for revolution that would resonate across centuries. He started with that immortal preamble, a sentence so powerful it has become a creed for freedom seekers everywhere. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Think about that for a moment. He didn't say these truths were debatable or required complex proof. He called them self-evident. As obvious as the sun in the sky, he declared that rights don't come from a king or a government, but from a creator, and they are unalienable. They cannot be taken away. This was revolutionary stuff. He then laid out the purpose of government, to secure these rights, and when a government fails to do that, becomes destructive, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. This wasn't just a declaration of independence. It was a user's manual for revolution, a justification for any people, anywhere, to throw off the chains of tyranny. After crafting this powerful philosophical foundation, Jefferson meticulously listed the colonists' specific grievances against King George III, building his case, point by point. He wrote of a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. Finally, after days of intense labor, with ink-stained fingers and a mind exhausted but focused, the draft was complete. It was a masterpiece of political prose, a symphony of liberty. He first showed it to Adams and Franklin, who made a few minor changes. Franklin, for instance, famously changed Jefferson's phrase, "a sacred and undeniable truth," to the simpler, more powerful, self-evident truth. Then, the draft was presented to the full Congress. And that is where our next chapter begins, as Jefferson's carefully chosen words faced the scrutiny, criticism, and revisions of 55 other men, a process that the sensitive Jefferson would later call a mutilation of his work. It's incredible to think that in a hot, rented room, One man's focused effort gave voice to the aspirations of millions and set the course for a new kind of nation. Jefferson's quiet work that summer proves that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with a bang, but with the scratching of a quill pen on paper. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the past. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. We'll see you in the next chapter. Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 9, Words That Changed the World. We're going to explore one of the most powerful documents ever written, the Declaration of Independence. It's more than just a piece of paper. It's a statement of ideals, a list of complaints, and a bold declaration of freedom that has echoed through centuries. So, let us unpack the genius behind Thomas Jefferson's draft and see how these words lit the fuse of revolution and continue to inspire people around the globe. Have you ever wondered how you structure a revolution? How do you tell a king and the entire world that you're breaking away to start your own country? Well, Jefferson did it with a clear, three-part structure that's both logical and incredibly persuasive. It's like a master class in argument. First, he lays the philosophical groundwork with the preamble. Then, he presents the evidence with a long list of grievances against the king. And finally, he delivers the powerful conclusion, a formal declaration of independence. Let's start at the beginning, with the part everyone knows and loves, the preamble. This is where the magic really happens. It doesn't start with, "Hey, King George, we're leaving." Instead, it starts with a universal statement about human rights. Jefferson wrote, "When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation." He's essentially saying, look, we're not just being difficult. We have very good reasons for this, and out of respect for the world, we're going to lay them all out. This was a brilliant move. It framed the American cause, not as a mere rebellion, but as a principled stand based on the laws of nature and reason. It was a PR move for the ages, aimed at winning both domestic and international support. And then we get to the most famous sentence in American history, perhaps one of the most famous sentences in the entire world. We hold these truths to be so, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Let's just pause and soak that in. Self-evident. That means these truths are so obvious, they don't need to be proven. They just are. Equality. In a world dominated by monarchies and aristocracies, the idea that all men are created equal was revolutionary. It completely upended the old social order and those inalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This wasn't just flowery language. It was a direct philosophical challenge to the idea that rights are granted by a government. Jefferson argued that these rights come from a higher power, from our very existence. The government's job isn't to give us rights. Its job is to protect the rights we already have. And if it fails to do that, the preamble goes on to say, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government. This was the ultimate justification for their actions. It wasn't treason. It was the people exercising their fundamental right to self-governance. This preamble set the stage for everything that followed, providing the moral and philosophical backbone for the entire revolution. Now, after that soaring, philosophical opening, the Declaration gets down to business. This is the second part of the document. The list of grievances. It's essentially a detailed, point-by-point indictment of King George III. Think of it as the longest breakup text in history. Jefferson didn't just say, "We're unhappy." He listed 27 specific abuses of power. This section is crucial because it moves from abstract principles to concrete examples. It showed the world that the colonists weren't acting on a whim. They had endured, as Jefferson put it, a long train of abuses and usurpations. Let us look at a few of these grievances to get a sense of what the colonists were dealing with. He wrote, that the king has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. This meant that even when colonial legislatures passed laws that would benefit their people, the king would just veto them. He was obstructing self-government at its most basic level. Another one he has kept among us. In times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. Imagine foreign soldiers quartered in your town, not to protect you, but to police you. This was a constant source of tension and a violation of a long-held English right. The list goes on, covering a wide range of issues. There's the famous imposing taxes on us without our consent. This was the core issue of no taxation without representation that had fueled protests for years. He also criticized the king for cutting off trade with the rest of the world, depriving them of trial by jury, and in some cases, transporting them across the sea to be tried for supposed offenses. Each grievance was carefully chosen to demonstrate a pattern of tyranny. Jefferson was building a legal case, brick by brick, proving that the British government was no longer protecting the rights of its American subjects, but was actively trying to establish an absolute tyranny over these states. This list was the evidence, the proof that breaking away was not just a right, but a necessity. After laying out the philosophical foundation in the preamble and providing the mountain of evidence in the list of grievances, Jefferson brings it all home with the third and final section, the closing statement of freedom. This is the official and formal declaration. It's where the colonists finally say, "We're done." The language here becomes very direct and resolute. It begins by stating that they have tried, repeatedly, to resolve these issues peacefully. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. This shows they exhausted all other options. Then comes the powerful conclusion. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states. That's it. The final break. They declare that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown and that all political connection between them and Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. This was an act of incredible bravery. The men who signed this document were effectively signing their own death warrants. They were committing treason against the most powerful empire on earth. But they didn't just declare what they were breaking from, they also declared what they were becoming. As free and independent states, they claimed the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may have right to. They weren't just rebels anymore. They were a new nation on the world stage, claiming their place among the powers of the earth, and they sealed this declaration with a profound pledge. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. It's a powerful ending, a personal commitment that underscores the gravity of their decision. So, when we look at the Declaration of Independence, we see more than just old words on parchment. We see a masterfully crafted argument for freedom, structured in three distinct parts. It starts with the universal ideals of the preamble, laying a timeless foundation for human rights. It then presents the concrete evidence of tyranny in the list of grievances, justifying the need for separation. And finally, it concludes with a bold and decisive statement of independence, formally severing ties and creating a new nation. The line, "All men are created equal," has been a beacon of hope and a catalyst for change ever since. Of course, the reality of 1776 didn't live up to that ideal. The man who wrote it owned enslaved people, and it would take centuries of struggle for women, African Americans, and other groups to gain even a semblance of that promised equality. But the power of the words themselves is that they set a standard, an aspiration for the new nation to strive toward. The fight for civil rights, women's suffrage, and other movements for justice have all drawn inspiration from that single phrase, holding America accountable to its own founding promise. The Declaration's words didn't just change the world in 1776. They continue to challenge and inspire us to build a more perfect union, a world where those self-evident truths apply to everyone. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the words that shaped a nation. It's a reminder that ideas, expressed with clarity and passion, can truly change the course of history. If you enjoyed this exploration and want to learn more, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'll see you in the next video. Welcome back to our series on the birth of America. Last time, we left Thomas Jefferson, quill in hand, tasked with drafting one of the most important documents in history. But did he do it all by himself? Not by a long shot. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on the unsung heroes of the Declaration of Independence, the Committee of Five. So, who were these guys? Imagine assembling a supergroup of the American Revolution. First, you have Jefferson, the eloquent Virginian, our lead writer. Then, there's the fiery, brilliant, and often cantankerous John Adams from Massachusetts. He was the powerhouse who pushed for independence from the very beginning. Representing Pennsylvania was the elder statesman, the wise and worldly Benjamin Franklin, a man whose reputation preceded him across the Atlantic. From Connecticut, we have Roger Sherman, a self-made man known for his practical wisdom and steady common sense. And finally, rounding out the group was Robert R. Livingston of New York, a wealthy, influential lawyer who brought a more conservative, cautious perspective to the table. These 5 men were appointed by the Second Continental Congress on June 11, 1776. Their mission was clear. Draft a statement explaining to the world why the 13 colonies were declaring themselves free and independent states. While they all agreed on the goal, their personalities and political leanings were incredibly diverse. Adams was the passionate driver, Franklin the calm diplomat, Sherman the practical anchor, and Livingston the voice of cautious consideration. Jefferson, though the youngest, was chosen for his peculiar felicity of expression, as Adams later put it. He had a gift for words, a talent for capturing the spirit of the age. They agreed that Jefferson should be the primary author. Why him? Well, Adams later gave a few reasons. First, Jefferson was a Virginian, and Adams believed a Virginian's voice would make the Declaration more palatable to the other colonies, especially since Massachusetts was already seen as a hotbed of radicalism. Second, Adams admitted, "I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise." Jefferson, ever modest, initially tried to get Adams to write it, but Adams was insistent. So, Jefferson retreated to his rented rooms on Market Street in Philadelphia and began to write. Over about 17 days, Jefferson worked tirelessly, drawing on Enlightenment philosophy, particularly the ideas of John Locke, and existing documents like Virginia's Declaration of Rights. He wasn't trying to invent new ideas, but to express what he called the American mind. He poured onto the page the grievances against King George III and the soaring ideals of liberty and self. When he finished, he had a draft, a powerful, eloquent, and revolutionary piece of writing, but it wasn't the final version. Now, it was time for review. It was time for the committee to do its work. Jefferson first showed his draft to the 2 members he respected the most, John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. This is where the magic of collaboration really shines. It's easy to imagine a writer being defensive about their work, but this was a team effort with a nation's future at stake. Adams and Franklin weren't just proofreaders. They were master wordsmiths and political strategists in their own right. They sat down with Jefferson, and line by line, they went through the document. John Adams, being the meticulous lawyer he was, made several small but significant changes. His edits were mostly about clarity and precision. He was focused on making sure the legal and philosophical arguments were airtight. He knew this document would be scrutinized by enemies and allies alike, and there could be no room for ambiguity. But the most famous and impactful edits came from the venerable Dr. Franklin. At 70 years old, Franklin was suffering from gout and often in pain, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He looked at Jefferson's original phrase, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." It's a good line, poetic and strong, but Franklin, with a simple stroke of his pen, suggested a change. He crossed out sacred and undeniable and replaced it with self-evident. Self-evident. Think about that. The change is subtle but brilliant. Sacred and undeniable implies that these truths come from a divine or higher authority, something you must accept on faith. But self-evident is a term from logic and science. It means these truths are so obvious, so fundamentally true, that they require no proof. They are universally accessible through reason. It transformed the statement from a matter of belief into a matter of rational fact. It was a masterstroke of rhetoric, making the American cause seem not just righteous, but logical and inevitable. This single edit elevated the document's most famous sentence into the timeless creed we know today. After Adams and Franklin made their suggestions, which Jefferson largely accepted and incorporated into a new copy, the revised draft was presented to the full Committee of Five. Sherman and Livingston reviewed it as well. While their specific contributions to the text are less documented, their approval was crucial. Their presence ensured the document represented a consensus of the different regional interests and political viewpoints within the colonies. Sherman, the pragmatic merchant, and Livingston, the cautious aristocrat. Signing off on this radical text showed that the call for independence had broad support among the colonial leadership. On June 28, 1776, the Committee of Five presented their finished draft to the Continental Congress. Their work as a committee was done, but the document's journey was far from over. It would now face the scrutiny of the entire Congress, an even larger and more critical group of editors. As we'll see in our next chapter, Congress would make even more changes, including one very significant deletion that would haunt the nation for generations. The story of the Declaration is a story of collaboration, compromise, and the power of words to change the world. The Committee of Five was the small, dedicated team that forged those words into a weapon for liberty. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into history. It's truly fascinating to see how this foundational document was a team effort. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn what happened next, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. We love having you here. See you next time. Hello, history lovers, and welcome back. Today, we're stepping into the pressure cooker of Philadelphia in late June of 1776. The air is thick, not just with summer heat, but with the tension of a decision that will change the world forever. We often imagine the Declaration of Independence as a moment of unified, fist-pumping triumph. But the reality, it was born from fierce, passionate, and sometimes bitter debate. The Continental Congress was a room divided, and the fate of a continent hung in the balance. Let's set the scene. For over a year, the colonies had been in open conflict with Great Britain. Battles had been fought, blood had been shed, and Thomas Paine's common sense had lit a fire in the hearts of many, arguing that the time for reconciliation was long over. Yet, as Richard Henry Lee's resolution for independence was brought before Congress, a deep and terrifying chasm opened up between the delegates. This wasn't just a political argument. It was a choice between security and the unknown, between loyalty to the crown and a radical leap into a future no one could predict. On one side, you had the moderates, the cautious voices. Think of men like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. He was no loyalist. He was a patriot who had ardently opposed British policies. But for him, declaring independence was like pushing a boat into a hurricane without a map or a rudder. He argued, "Let us wait. Let us form alliances first. Let us draft a constitution. Let us prove we can govern ourselves before we sever the final tie." Dickinson's fear was practical and profound. To declare independence was to commit treason in the eyes of the most powerful empire on earth. If they failed, every man in that room would face the gallows. He worried that the colonies were not unified enough. Could New Englanders truly stand with Virginia? Could the colonies, with their squabbling interests, form a cohesive nation capable of withstanding the full might of the British military? He pleaded with his colleagues to consider the consequences. Cities burned, economies shattered, and the potential for a brutal civil war among the colonies themselves. For Dickinson and his allies, this was a premature, reckless gamble that could lead to utter annihilation. On the other side of the aisle were the radicals, the firebrands. Leading the charge was the passionate, and often abrasive, John Adams of Massachusetts. For Adams, and men like Thomas Jefferson and Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, caution was no longer an option. It was a death sentence. Adams thundered that Britain had already decided their fate. King George III had declared them rebels, hired foreign mercenaries to fight them, and closed their ports. To wait for alliances was to put the cart before the horse. No European power, especially France, would ever officially help them as long as they were merely rebellious British subjects. They would only ally with a free and independent nation. Adams argued that survival itself depended on this declaration. It was the only way to galvanize the people, to secure foreign aid, and to give their soldiers a cause truly worth dying for. He saw a continued connection to Britain as a cancer that would slowly destroy them. Every day they waited was another day Britain could reinforce its armies and crush their spirit. For Adams, independence wasn't a choice. It was the only path forward. The time for debate was over. The time for action was now. He argued that the people were already ahead of Congress, that the spirit of independence was already sweeping through the colonies. Congress simply needed to catch up to the will of the populace. Imagine the atmosphere in Independence Hall. The windows were kept shut to prevent spies from overhearing, turning the room into a sweltering oven. Delegates shouted, argued, and pleaded. Friendships were strained, and the weight of their decision was immense. Edward Rutledge of South Carolina, a young and brilliant delegate, sided with Dickinson. He feared that a powerful New England would dominate a new Union and that the southern colonies would be left to fend for themselves. He believed that the time was not yet ripe. The debate raged 4 days. It was a clash of ideologies. Prudence versus passion, security versus freedom. The moderates saw the radicals as reckless fanatics who were leading them to ruin. The radicals saw the moderates as timid and short-sighted, unable to grasp the historic moment they were in. It wasn't a simple disagreement. It was a fundamental conflict over the very identity and future of America. Each side believed, with absolute conviction, that their path was the only one that could save the colonies from destruction. The delegates were not just debating a document, they were wrestling with their fears, their hopes, and the lives of every person in the 13 colonies. As the end of June approached, the momentum began to shift. The voices for independence grew stronger, bolstered by news from the colonies where local governments were already drafting their own declarations and constitutions. The delegates realized that the people out of doors, as Adams called them, were not waiting for permission. The tide of history was pulling them in one irreversible direction. The debate had been crucial, forcing every delegate to confront the awesome consequences of their actions. But now, a decision had to be made. On July 1, they would vote. The question of whether they would remain colonies or become the United States of America was about to be answered. And that, my friends, is the dramatic, high-stakes reality behind the birth of a nation. It wasn't a foregone conclusion, but a hard-won victory forged in the crucible of debate. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. We'll see you in the next video. Picture this. Fireworks lighting up the night sky, barbecues sizzling in backyards, and parades marching down Main Street. What day comes to mind? July 4th, of course. But what if I told you we've been celebrating on the wrong day all along? That the real birthday of the United States is actually Yuli Dozenedi. Stick with me because this is one of the most fascinating and overlooked twists in American history. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through the birth of a nation. Today, in Chapter 12, we're diving into the vote for freedom. We all know July 4th, 1776, as the day the Declaration of Independence was signed, but the pivotal, world-changing decision, the actual vote to break away from Great Britain, happened 2 days earlier. Let's set the scene. It's the summer of 1776 in Philadelphia. The air is thick with humidity, and even thicker with tension. Delegates from the 13 colonies are gathered in the Pennsylvania State House, now known as Independence Hall. For months, they've been debating, arguing, and agonizing over the most monumental question of their lives. Should they declare independence from the most powerful empire on earth? It was a decision that meant risking everything, their property, their reputations, and their very lives for treason. The push for independence had been gaining momentum. Thomas Paine's common sense had electrified the colonies earlier that year, making a powerful case for a complete break. Royal authority was crumbling, and provisional governments were springing up. On June 7, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia stood before the Continental Congress and proposed a simple, yet earth-shattering resolution that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. This was it, the moment of truth. But not everyone was ready to jump. Some delegates, like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, urged caution. They still hoped for reconciliation with King George III. They argued that declaring independence was like trying to brave a stormy sea in a paper boat. The debate was fierce and passionate. The fate of a continent hung in the balance, to allow time for the more hesitant colonies to get on board. The Congress postponed the final vote on Lee's resolution until the beginning of July. In the meantime, they appointed a committee of 5 to draft a formal declaration, just in case the vote passed. This committee, as you probably know, included Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin. Jefferson was chosen to be the primary author, and he spent the next few weeks crafting the eloquent and powerful words we know so well today. Finally, the day arrived. July 1st, 1776. The Congress resolved itself into a committee of the whole to debate Lee's resolution one last time. John Adams, the fiery patriot from Massachusetts, argued passionately for independence. John Dickinson gave an equally compelling speech against it, pleading for prudence. When they took a preliminary vote that day, 9 colonies were in favor. Pennsylvania and South Carolina voted no. Delaware was deadlocked, and New York had abstained, still waiting for instructions from home. The supporters of independence knew they needed more unity. The decision had to be as unanimous as possible. So, they decided to delay the official, final vote until the next day. Huli tho synod. And that's where our story takes its crucial turn. On July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress reconvened. A few key things had changed overnight. Caesar Rodney of Delaware, a pro-independence delegate, had ridden 80 miles through a thunderstorm to break his state's tie. South Carolina's delegation, seeing the tide turning, changed its vote for the sake of unity. And Pennsylvania's delegation also shifted, as 2 opponents of independence strategically stayed away, allowing the majority to vote yes. So, when the final vote was taken, it was 12 colonies in favor, with New York still abstaining. They would approve it a week later. The resolution for independence had passed. On that day, July 2nd, the political bond with Great Britain was officially severed. The United Colonies were now, in their own eyes, the United States of America. John Adams was ecstatic. He immediately wrote to his wife, Abigail, convinced that this day would be immortalized in American history. He wrote, "The 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival." He even predicted how it would be celebrated, with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other from this time forward forevermore. Sound familiar? He got every detail right except for the date. So, what happened? Why do we celebrate on the 4th? Well, after they voted for independence on July 2nd, the Congress still had the matter of that formal document the Committee of 5 had drafted. They spent the next 2 days editing Jefferson's work. They made about 86 changes, including famously removing a passage that condemned the slave trade. Finally, on the evening of July 4th, they approved the final wording of the Declaration of Independence. The document was then sent to a printer, John Dunlap, who worked through the night to produce copies, known as the Dunlap broadsides. These were sent out to the state assemblies, committees of safety, and the commanders of the Continental Army. When people across the colonies heard the news of independence, it was the declaration they read or had read to them. The date printed right at the top was in Congress, July 4th, 1776. This document, with its soaring rhetoric about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is what captured the public imagination. It was the public announcement, the birth certificate. The vote on July 2nd was the legal act, the moment of conception, if you will. But the approval and publication of the Declaration on July 4th was the public proclamation, the moment the world was told of this new nation's arrival. Over time, the date on the famous document overshadowed the date of the actual vote. People began associating independence with the powerful words of the Declaration and the date printed on it. By the early 19th century, July 4th was firmly established as the national holiday. John Adams, for his part, was reportedly a bit grumpy about this. He was said to have turned down invitations to July 4th celebrations for the rest of his life, stubbornly maintaining that July 2nd was the real Independence Day. In a truly poetic twist of fate, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, friends, and the two central figures of independence, died on the exact same day, July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration. It was as if history itself put a final, definitive stamp on the date. So, when you see those fireworks this year, take a moment to remember July 2nd. Remember the tense debate, the courageous vote, and John Adams's passionate belief that this day would be remembered forever. While we celebrate on the 4th, the decision that made it all possible happened 2 days earlier. It's a fantastic piece of trivia, but it's more than that. It reminds us that history is often messier, more complex, and more interesting than the simple stories we learn. The birth of the United States wasn't a single event, but a process of debate, compromise, and incredible bravery. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive into America's real birthday. It's these kinds of hidden stories that make history so alive and compelling. If you enjoyed this, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We have so much more to explore together. Until next time, stay curious. Hello and welcome back to our journey through the American Revolution. Last time, we left the Continental Congress, deep in debate over Thomas Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence. The air in Philadelphia was thick with tension, humidity, and the weight of history. Today, we arrive at the pivotal moment, July 4th, 1776. After days of intense scrutiny and revision, the delegates had whittled down Jefferson's original text. They debated every word, every phrase, every accusation against King George III. It was a process of compromise and consensus. Passages condemning the slave trade, for example, were removed to secure the support of Southern colonies, a difficult compromise that would have long-lasting consequences. But the core principles of liberty, equality, and self-governance remained intact, shining brighter than ever. On the morning of July 4th, a revised draft was presented to the Congress. The time for debate was over. A vote was called colony by colony. The delegates cast their votes. The result was nearly unanimous. 12 colonies voted in favor. New York, still awaiting instructions, abstained, but would add its approval a few days later. With that, the Declaration of Independence was officially adopted. Imagine the scene inside what we now call Independence Hall, a mix of relief, exhilaration, and solemnity. Must have filled the room. These men had just committed treason against the most powerful empire on earth. They were no longer just disgruntled colonists. They were the founding representatives of a new nation. John Hancock, as president of the Congress, was the first to sign the official manuscript copy, reportedly with a large, bold signature so that King George could read it without his spectacles. This document wasn't just a list of grievances. It was a profound statement of human rights and a declaration of a new political philosophy. It proclaimed that all men are created equal, endowed with certain unalienable rights, and that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. It was a radical idea then, and it remains a powerful ideal today. That evening, the first public readings of the Declaration took place. Bells rang out across Philadelphia, most famously the State House bell, which would later be known as the Liberty Bell. Bonfires were lit, and celebrations erupted. News spread like wildfire up and down the coast. In New York City, upon hearing the news, soldiers and citizens pulled down a statue of King George III, a symbolic toppling of the old regime. It's important to remember that on July 4th, 1776, the United States of America was born on paper. The war for independence was far from over. In fact, the hardest years of fighting were still ahead. This piece of parchment didn't magically create a country. What it did was give the struggle a clear, unified, and noble purpose. It transformed a colonial rebellion into a revolutionary war for the creation of a new republic founded on the principles of liberty. The Declaration of Independence was a promise of freedom and self-determination. It was an audacious gamble made by a small group of determined individuals who pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to a cause greater than themselves. The signing of the Declaration wasn't an end, but a beginning. It was the moment the colonies formally broke from Great Britain and set out on their own uncertain, perilous, but hopeful path toward becoming the United States of America. The words penned in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776 have echoed through the centuries, inspiring countless movements for freedom and democracy around the globe. It serves as a constant reminder of the ideals upon which the nation was founded and the ongoing work required to live up to them. Thank you so much for joining me for this pivotal chapter in American history. The story is just getting started, and the fight for independence is about to get very real. If you found this video enlightening, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you do UNM as our next episode. As always, I love reading your thoughts and questions in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to our journey through the American Revolution. Last time, we witnessed the monumental moment the Declaration of Independence was signed. But a document, no matter how powerful, is just ink on parchment until its message reaches the people. Today, we're diving into the electric atmosphere of its very first public reading, a day when the words of revolution echoed through the streets and into the hearts of a new nation. This is the story of how a declaration became a reality for the common citizen. Imagine the date, July 8, 1776. The air in Philadelphia is thick with the sweltering heat of summer. But there's another kind of energy crackling through the city. A palpable mix of anticipation, anxiety, and hope. Just 4 days earlier, behind the closed doors of the Pennsylvania State House, which we now know as Independence Hall, the Second Continental Congress had adopted a document that would sever ties with the most powerful empire on earth. The delegates had pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. But for the average shopkeeper, artisan, or farmer walking the cobblestone streets, this was still just a rumor, a whisper carried on the wind. The secrecy couldn't last. The whole point of the Declaration was to be, well, asterisk. Declared asterisk. It was a statement to the world, but first and foremost, it was a statement to the American people. It was their consent that gave the revolution its legitimacy. So, the Continental Congress ordered the document to be printed and distributed throughout the colonies, to be read aloud in town squares, churches, and to the Continental Army. The very first of these public readings was scheduled for noon, right here in Philadelphia, in the yard of the State House. As the clock tower neared midday, a crowd began to gather. This wasn't a gathering of politicians in powdered wigs. It was a cross-section of Philadelphia society, men, women, and children, from all walks of life, filled the square. They were drawn by curiosity, by a sense of momentous change hanging in the air. The official town crier had been making his rounds, announcing the event. Word spread like wildfire. People left their workshops, their homes, their daily chores, all converging on this central point, eager to hear what their leaders had decided. At exactly noon, the doors of the State House opened. Emerging onto a specially constructed wooden platform, or observatory, was Colonel John Nixon. He wasn't a famous politician or a fiery orator like Patrick Henry. He was a respected local figure, a commander of the city's militia, a man of the people. In his hand, he held a freshly printed copy of the Declaration of Independence. The crowd hushed, a wave of silence falling over the square. Every eye was fixed on him. This was it, the moment of truth. Colonel Nixon cleared his throat, and his voice, strong and steady, cut through the summer air. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another ... He began to read. He didn't just read the words, he proclaimed them. Imagine hearing this for the first time. For years, the colonists had spoken of their rights as Englishmen. Now, they were hearing a new language, a language of universal human rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Think about the power of those words hitting the ears of the crowd. It wasn't just a political argument, it was a moral and philosophical earthquake. It was a promise that a government should serve the people, not the other way around. As Nixon continued, reading the long list of grievances against King George III, the mood of the crowd shifted. The initial quiet curiosity transformed into audible murmurs of agreement, then into shouts of affirmation. These weren't abstract complaints. They were the lived experiences of the people listening. The taxes imposed without their consent, the soldiers quartered in their homes, the denial of trial by jury. Each charge was a validation of their own frustrations and hardships. The king was no longer a distant, paternal figure. He was framed as a tyrant. And then came the final, earth-shattering lines. That these united colonies are, and of right ought to be free and independent states. That they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, ... At that moment, something broke. The dam of colonial loyalty, already cracked and strained, finally burst. The concept of independence was no longer a radical idea debated by elites in a closed room. It was a public proclamation. A shared commitment. The moment Nixon finished reading, the square erupted. A wave of cheers washed over the courtyard, a spontaneous thunderous roar of approval and joy. It was a sound of release, of catharsis. Hats were thrown into the air. People hugged strangers, their faces beaming with a mix of defiance and exhilaration. The spirit of independence, once a flickering flame, was now a roaring bonfire. Immediately following the cheers, another sound began to fill the air, the ringing of bells. From the State House Tower, the Liberty Bell, though it wasn't yet called that, beg unto pill. Its deep, resonant tone was soon joined by the bells of every church in Philadelphia. The city was engulfed in a symphony of celebration. This wasn't just noise. It was a declaration in its own right, a sonic announcement that a new era had begun. The sound carried across the city, telling everyone, even those who couldn't be in the square, that the colonies were now free. The celebration didn't end with cheers and bells. That evening, the crowd's revolutionary fervor took a more symbolic form. They marched through the city to the State House, where they pulled down the king's coat of arms, the lion and the unicorn that adorned the building. They carried this symbol of royal authority to the center of town and threw it onto a massive bonfire, along with other symbols of the monarchy. It was a powerful, symbolic act of rejection, a clear visual statement that the king's rule was over. They weren't just declaring independence. They were physically erasing the vestiges of the old regime. This scene in Philadelphia was just the beginning. As copies of the Declaration reached other cities and towns, similar celebrations erupted. In New York City, General George Washington had the Declaration read to his troops. Afterward, an energized crowd of soldiers and citizens marched down to Bowling Green and pulled down a massive lead statue of King George III on horseback. The statue was later melted down to make over 42,000 musket balls for the Continental Army, a beautifully ironic and practical act of rebellion, turning a symbol of the oppressor into the means of fighting him. From Boston to Savannah, the words were read, and the people responded. The Declaration of Independence did more than just announce a political break. It united the 13 disparate colonies under a single, powerful idea. It gave them a common cause and a shared identity. It transformed a series of protests and skirmishes into a full-blown revolution for a new nation founded on the principles of liberty and equality. The first public reading on July 8, 1776, was the day the United States of America was truly born in spirit, not in a quiet hall, but in the loud, joyful, and defiant shouts of its people. Thank you so much for joining us for this pivotal chapter in American history. It's a powerful reminder that history is made not just by signatures on a page, but by the people who embrace its message. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. We'll see you next time. Friends, patriots, history lovers, welcome back to our journey. In our last chapter, a monumental document was born. Now, in chapter 16, we witness how those powerful words didn't just stay in Philadelphia, they took flight, traveling across the colonies and eventually the world. Imagine the scene. July 4th, 1776. The Declaration of Independence is approved, but a document is just ink on parchment until people know what it says. The Continental Congress knew this. They immediately ordered it to be printed. John Dunlap, a printer just blocks away from Independence Hall, worked through the night. By the morning of July 5th, about 200 copies, now famously known as the Dunlap broadsides, were ready. These weren't fancy, signed documents. They were posters, meant to be read aloud, nailed to tavern doors, and shared in town squares. There was no internet. Number 24-hour news. The news traveled at the speed of a horse. Riders were dispatched from Philadelphia, fanning out in all directions, carrying these precious papers. Think of the excitement. A rider gallops into a town, dust flying. A dismonce crowd gathers, and for the first time, people hear those electrifying words. We hold these truths to be that all men are created equal. For many, this was the first they knew of independence. It wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was a declared fact. On July 8, in Philadelphia, the Declaration was read publicly for the first time at the State House yard. The Liberty Bell, then just the State House bell, rang out, summoning citizens. Colonel John Nixon stood on a makeshift stage and read the document to a cheering crowd. Similar scenes erupted across the colonies as the broadsides arrived. In New York City, General George Washington had it read to his troops. Hearing these principles gave them a profound sense of purpose. They weren't just fighting against unfair taxes anymore. They were fighting for the birth of a new nation founded on liberty. In response, an energized crowd of soldiers and citizens toppled a massive statue of King George III. The words spread like wildfire. Newspapers, the social media of the 18th century, reprinted the text in full. From New Hampshire to Georgia, the Declaration became a rallying cry. It unified the 13 disparate colonies in a common cause, transforming a rebellion into a revolution. It gave a name and a creed to their struggle. People weren't just colonists anymore. They were Americans. But the journey of these words didn't stop at the Atlantic coast. Copies were sent aboard ships, embarking on a much longer journey to Europe. This was a crucial part of the plan. The Founding Fathers needed allies, particularly France, Britain's age-old rival. The Declaration was, in many ways, an international plea for help. It was a message to the world that said, "We are a sovereign nation, worthy of your recognition and support." When the Declaration reached France, it was a sensation. Thinkers of the French Enlightenment, like Voltaire and Rousseau, had long been writing about liberty, natural rights, and the social contract. Now, here was a group of people across the ocean actually putting those ideas into practice. For French intellectuals and reformists, America became a shining example, a real-world experiment in freedom. Benjamin Franklin, already a celebrity in Paris for his scientific achievements, became America's first ambassador. He used the Declaration as his ultimate diplomatic tool. He wasn't just asking for money and ships. He was representing a nation built on the most progressive ideals of the age. The French public was captivated. The Declaration was translated, discussed in salons, and celebrated as a victory for all humanity. This public support put immense pressure on the French monarchy. While King Louis XVI might not have cared much for Republican ideals, he cared a great deal about weakening Great Britain. The Declaration's powerful statement of purpose and the popular support it generated helped convince him that the American cause was legitimate and had a real chance of success. In 1778, France officially recognized the United States and signed a treaty of alliance. This was a massive turning point in the war. French money, soldiers, and, most importantly, the French Navy would prove decisive in securing American victory. The influence didn't stop in France. The Declaration resonated across Europe and beyond. It inspired reformers in Poland, revolutionaries in Latin America, and activists fighting for freedom for generations to come. It set a new standard for what a nation could be. The idea that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed was a radical concept that challenged monarchies and empires everywhere. The words of the Declaration became a global symbol of human rights and self-determination. When other nations drafted their own declarations of independence, from Haiti to Vietnam, They often looked to Jefferson's words for inspiration. It became a foundational text for the very concept of universal human rights, influencing the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, and, much later, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations. It's astonishing to think how a few hundred words, written by candlelight in a Philadelphia summer, could travel so far and change the world so profoundly. They gave a voice to the American Revolution, secured a crucial alliance, and planted seeds of liberty that would blossom across the globe for centuries. The journey of these words is a testament to their enduring power, a power that continues to inspire people to fight for freedom and equality to this very day. Thank you for joining me for this incredible chapter of the story. The journey of these words is truly one of the most remarkable tales in history. If you've enjoyed this deep dive, please give this video a thumbs up. And do not forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss what happens next. We've got more of the story to tell. Until next time, stay curious. Upbeat, engaging intro music fades slightly to the background. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. In our last chapter, we witnessed a monumental moment. The signing of the Declaration of Independence, a powerful statement, a bold promise of a new nation founded on liberty. But here's the thing about promises: they have to be kept. And signing a piece of paper, no matter how revolutionary, doesn't win a war. So, picture this. It's July 1776. The ink is barely dry on the Declaration, and celebrations are erupting in the streets. But for the Continental Army, led by General George Washington, this was just the beginning of the fight. They were a scrappy, under-equipped group of farmers, merchants, and artisans going up against the most formidable military machine on the planet, the British Empire. Winning independence wouldn't be a walk in the park. It would be a long, grueling marathon that would test the very limits of their endurance. The British certainly weren't going to just pack up and go home. King George III and Parliament saw the Declaration as an act of outright rebellion, and they were determined to crush it. They dispatched a massive force to America. We're talking tens of thousands of professional soldiers, known as Redcoats, along with thousands of Hessian mercenaries from Germany. Their navy, the Royal Navy, was unmatched, controlling the seas and able to land troops almost anywhere along the coast. On paper, this was a complete mismatch. The British were confident this little rebellion would be over by Christmas, and for a while, it looked like they were right. The months following the Declaration were brutal for the Americans. The Battle of Long Island in August 1776 was a disaster. Washington's army was outmaneuvered and overwhelmed, forced into a desperate retreat from New York City. They were pushed back through New Jersey and across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. Morale plummeted. The soldiers were cold, hungry, and their enlistments were about to expire. The dream of independence seemed to be freezing to death in the harsh winter of 1776. It was a moment of absolute crisis. But this is where legends are born. On a freezing Christmas night, Washington made a decision that would change everything. He gathered his weary troops and led them on a daring, secret crossing of the icy Delaware River. Their target was the Hessian garrison stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. The Hessians, celebrating the holiday, were caught completely by surprise. The resulting American victory at the Battle of Trenton was stunning. It was a small battle in the grand scheme of things, but its impact was immense. It was a shot of adrenaline for the revolution. It proved that the Continental Army could win, that they weren't just a ragtag militia, and it inspired thousands of soldiers to The fire of revolution, which had been flickering, was reignited. This victory set the stage for another crucial win just days later at the Battle of Princeton. These back-to-back successes boosted American morale sky-high and showed the world that this was going to be a short, simple conflict. However, the path ahead was still filled with incredible hardship. The winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge is a name that has become synonymous with suffering and perseverance. There was no major battle fought there, but the enemy was just as deadly. Starvation, disease, and the brutal cold. Thousands of soldiers perished without ever seeing a redcoat. Yet, through it all, they held on. It was at Valley Forge that a Prussian military officer, Baron von Steuben, arrived and transformed the Continental Army. He drilled the soldiers relentlessly, teaching them proper military tactics, discipline, and hygiene. The army that marched out of Valley Forge in the spring was tougher, more professional, and more unified than ever before. While Washington's army was being forged in the crucible of Valley Forge, a pivotal turning point was happening up north. In 1777, the British launched a major campaign to split the New England colonies from the rest. But their plan went disastrously wrong. At the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York, an entire British army was surrounded and forced to surrender to American forces led by General Horatio Gates. Saratoga was more than just a military victory. It was a diplomatic triumph. This decisive win convinced France that the Americans actually had a chance to win the war. Eager for revenge against Britain after the French and Indian War, France officially recognized the United States and formed a military alliance. This was a game-changer. French money, weapons, soldiers, and, most importantly, the French Navy were now entering the fray. The revolution had become a world war. With France in the fight, the conflict expanded. Spain and the Netherlands also eventually joined the war against Britain, stretching British resources thin across the globe. The war in America shifted its focus to the southern colonies. The British hoped to find more Loyalist support there and implemented a southern strategy. They captured major cities like Savannah and Charleston, and for a time, it seemed to be working. Battles at Camden and Waxhaws were brutal British victories. But the American spirit of resistance was relentless. Patriot militias using guerrilla tactics waged a fierce campaign in the backcountry, led by commanders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. They would strike quickly and disappear back into the swamps and forests, frustrating and draining the British forces. The war in the South became a long, bloody stalemate. The British won many of the battles but couldn't control the countryside or crush the rebellion. The American commander in the South, Nathaniel Greene, brilliantly executed a strategy of attrition. He knew he didn't have to win every battle. He just had to keep his army intact and wear down the British army under General Cornwallis. After a costly battle at Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina, Cornwallis, despite winning a tactical victory, had lost so many men that he was forced to abandon his campaign in the Carolinas and march his exhausted army north into Virginia. He chose a small port town to rest and resupply his troops. That town was Yorktown, and this is where everything came together. Washington saw his chance. In a masterpiece of strategic coordination, he secretly marched his American army, along with a large French force, south from New York to Virginia. At the same time, the French Navy sailed up from the Caribbean and blockaded the Chesapeake Bay, trapping Cornwallis. The British Navy tried to break through, but was defeated. Cornwallis was completely cut off, surrounded on land by the combined American and French armies, and blocked at sea by the French fleet. The siege of Yorktown began. For 3 weeks, artillery pounded the British defenses. Finally, on October 19, 1781, with no hope of escape or reinforcement, General Cornwallis surrendered his entire army. The cannons fell silent. The world was stunned. The surrender at Yorktown effectively ended major combat in the Revolutionary War. While some smaller skirmishes continued, the British government lost the political will to continue fighting. The war had been too long, too expensive, and now too humiliating. Peace negotiations began in Paris. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. In it, Great Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. After 8 long years of struggle, sacrifice, and incredible determination, the war was finally over. The promise made in the Declaration of Independence had been fulfilled, not with ink and parchment, but with blood, sweat, and an unbreakable will to be free. The United States was no longer a dream. It was a reality. What an incredible story of perseverance against all odds. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. If you found this journey as inspiring as I do, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. We'll see you in the next chapter. Hello, and welcome back. Today, we're embarking on the final chapter of our journey, a story that reaches far beyond a single moment in time. We're exploring Chapter 18, The Legacy of 1776. We've talked about the battles, the politics, and the people. But what happened after the ink dried on the Declaration of Independence? What did those powerful words, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, truly set in motion? It's a legacy far more complex and enduring than the founders themselves could have ever imagined. A ripple effect that continues to shape our world today. Let's start with the most immediate impact. The birth of American democracy. The Declaration wasn't a legal document that established a government. The Constitution would do that later. Instead, it was a moral and philosophical blueprint. It boldly stated that governments don't grant rights. They are created to protect rights that people already possess. This was a radical, world-changing idea. Before this, power was seen as flowing down from a monarch or a divine authority. The Declaration flipped the pyramid upside down, declaring that legitimate power flows up from the consent of the governed. This principle became the bedrock of the American experiment. It meant that citizens were no longer subjects, but active participants in their own governance. The very act of declaring independence was an assertion of popular sovereignty. It inspired the creation of a republic where leaders were elected, not born into power. Of course, the reality was messy and imperfect. The system they built was far from inclusive, a contradiction we'll address shortly. But the core idea that the people are the ultimate source of authority was unleashed upon the world, and it was a fire that could not be extinguished. The Declaration's influence quickly leaped across the Atlantic. Picture this. It's the late 1780s in France. The nation is teetering on the brink of revolution, burdened by debt, social inequality, and an absolute monarchy. French soldiers who had fought alongside the Americans, like the Marquis de Lafayette, returned home not just with stories of war, but with revolutionary ideas. They had seen a people rise up and claim their own sovereignty. The American experiment was a living, breathing example that a different future was possible. In 1789, the French people issued their own revolutionary creed, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Read its opening lines, and the echoes of Jefferson are unmistakable. It speaks of natural, inalienable, and sacred rights, of liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It declared that all citizens are equal before the law. The French Revolution was, of course, its own unique and far more violent event, but the intellectual spark from America provided a powerful catalyst. It demonstrated that the philosophical ideals of the Enlightenment weren't just for textbooks. They could be used to dismantle centuries-old systems of power. The flame of 1776 didn't stop in France. It became a global beacon for those yearning for freedom. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, independence movements across Latin America, from Venezuela to Argentina, looked to the United States as a model. Leaders like Simon Bolivar, known as the Liberator, deeply admired the American system and drew inspiration from its founding principles as he fought to free South America from Spanish colonial rule. The Declaration's words were translated, adapted, and reinterpreted in countless contexts. In 1847, Liberia, a nation founded by formerly enslaved people from the United States, modeled its own Declaration of Independence directly on the American text. Decades later, in 1945, Ho Chi Minh stood before a crowd in Hanoi to declare Vietnam's independence from French colonial rule. He didn't begin with a quote from a Vietnamese scholar or a French philosopher. He began by quoting Thomas Jefferson. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He used the colonizers' own ideals against them, highlighting the hypocrisy of nations that preached liberty at home while practicing oppression abroad. The legacy of 1776 had become a powerful tool for decolonization, a universal language of liberation. But this brings us to the most profound and challenging part of the Declaration's legacy: the idea of equality. When Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal," he owned over 100 enslaved people. This glaring contradiction has haunted America since its inception. The rights and freedoms celebrated in 1776 were, in practice, reserved for a select group: white, property-owning men, women, Native Americans, and, most brutally enslaved African Americans were excluded from this vision of equality. So, was the Declaration a lie? For many, it certainly was. But for others, it became a promise. It was a standard to which the nation could be held accountable. The struggle for human rights within America has been a centuries-long effort to close the gap between the nation's ideals and its reality. Abolitionists in the 19th century, like Frederick Douglass, wielded the Declaration as their greatest weapon. In his famous 1852 speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" he called out the nation's hypocrisy, but also appealed to its founding principles as the very source of potential redemption. He wasn't rejecting the idea of equality. He was demanding it be fulfilled. This fight for inclusion continued with the women's suffrage movement. In 1848, at the Seneca Falls Convention, activists drafted the Declaration of Sentiments. They took Jefferson's text and made a simple, powerful change. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." They used the nation's own foundational language to demand their right to vote and participate in the democracy they were a part of. And, of course, the civil rights movement of the 20th century was, at its core, a struggle to make the promise of 1776 real for all Americans. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, he spoke of the Declaration as a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. He said the nation had defaulted on this promise for its citizens of color, but he refused to believe the Bank of Justice was bankrupt. His dream was deeply rooted in the American dream, a dream of a nation finally living up to its founding creed. Today, the legacy of 1776 is still being debated and fought over. The Declaration of Independence isn't just a historical artifact, it's a living document. Its meaning is continually reinterpreted by each new generation. Debates about immigration, voting rights, economic justice, and LGBTQ rights are all, in their own way, conversations about who is included in the phrase, "all men are created equal," and what the pursuit of happiness truly means in the 21st century. The power of 1776 lies not in a perfect past, but in its aspirational future. It gave us a set of ideals that are incredibly difficult to live up to. It set a standard so high that we have spent over 2 centuries striving, and often failing, to meet it. But in that striving, in that constant struggle to form a more perfect union, lies the true, enduring legacy of the Declaration of Independence. It is a legacy of revolution, of inspiration, of profound contradiction, and, most importantly, of a promise yet to be fully kept. It challenges us, it inspires us, and it invites us to continue the work of building a world where life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are not just words on a page, but a reality for all. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through American history. It's been an honor to explore these stories with you. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more content. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, take care. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through American history. We've spent so much time exploring the monumental events that shaped a nation. But what about the men who risked everything to bring it into existence? Today, we're going to look beyond the ink and parchment, beyond the battlefield and the Congressional Hall, to discover what became of the key signers of the Declaration of Independence. These weren't just names on a document. They were individuals with families, passions, and destinies that continued long after that fateful summer of 1776. Let's start with the intellectual giant, Benjamin. By the time he signed the Declaration, he was already 70 years old, a world-renowned scientist, inventor, and diplomat. His work was far from over. After securing the crucial French alliance during the Revolution, he returned home a hero. He then served as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, lending his wisdom and steadying presence to the creation of another of America's founding documents. Franklin was a tireless advocate for abolition, becoming the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. He spent his final years surrounded by his grandchildren, continuing to write and invent until his passing in 1790 at the age of 84. His funeral in Philadelphia was a massive event, a testament to the love and respect he had earned. He left behind a legacy not just of political achievement, but of civic virtue and relentless curiosity. Now, let's turn to the dynamic and often contentious duo, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. The principal author of the Declaration and its most passionate advocate, Their lives were intertwined in a complex tapestry of friendship, rivalry, and eventual reconciliation. After the war, both served the new nation of Rotterdams as the first minister to Great Britain and Jefferson to France. Their political differences, however, soon drove them apart. Adams, a Federalist, became the second president, with Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, as his vice president. The political climate of the 1790s was incredibly toxic, and their friendship fractured under the strain, culminating in the bitter election of 1800, where Jefferson defeated Adams. For over a decade, they didn't speak, a silence filled with political disagreement and personal hurt. But history and a mutual friend, Dr. Benjamin Rush, had another chapter in mind for them. In 1812, Adams, in his retirement in Massachusetts, decided to break the silence. He sent a short, cordial letter to Jefferson at Monticello. Jefferson's reply was warm and immediate. This sparked one of the most remarkable correspondences in American history. For the next 14 years, they exchanged letters, debating everything from philosophy and religion to politics and their own legacies. They rebuilt their friendship, finding common ground in their shared experience of creating a nation. And this leads us to one of the most poetic and almost unbelievable coincidences in all of history. As the nation prepared to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1826, both men were gravely ill. In Massachusetts, 90-year-old John Adams lay on his deathbed. His last words were reported to be, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He was unaware that, hours earlier, hundreds of miles away in Virginia, his friend and rival, Thomas Jefferson, had also passed away. Two of the central figures of the Revolution, the author and the champion of the Declaration, both died on the 50th anniversary of the very day their shared masterpiece was adopted. It's a moment so profound it feels like something from a novel, a final, poignant punctuation mark on their incredible lives. But what about the other signers? Their fates were as varied as their backgrounds. John Hancock, whose flamboyant signature is so famous, served as the first governor of Massachusetts for many years, a beloved and popular leader until his death in 1793. Samuel Adams, the fiery Boston radical, also went on to serve as governor of Massachusetts after Hancock. He remained a staunch defender of Republican principles until his passing in 1803. Dr. Benjamin Rush of Pennsylvania, the man who helped reconcile Adams and Jefferson, continued his work as a physician and social reformer. He was a pioneer in mental health treatment and a passionate advocate for education and the abolition of slavery. Not all fates were so peaceful. Many signers suffered greatly during the war itself. Their homes were looted and burned, their families targeted. Richard Stockton of New Jersey was captured by the British, brutally treated in prison, and his health was broken. He died before the war even ended. Carter Braxton of Virginia lost his fortune, investing heavily in the Patriot cause and suffering shipping losses. Died in debt, a stark reminder of the personal sacrifices made. These men didn't just pledge their sacred honor in words, they lived it, and for some, it cost them everything. Yet many survived and thrived, helping to build the very government they had declared into existence. Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the only Catholic signer, outlived them all. He invested wisely in ventures like the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, symbolizing the transition from the Revolutionary era to the new industrial age. When he passed away in 1832 at the age of 95, he was the last surviving signer, a living link to that audacious moment in Philadelphia. His death truly marked the end of an era, from presidents and governors to doctors and businessmen. The 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence went on to live complex and fascinating lives. They were flawed, brilliant, and courageous human beings who, in one profound act, altered the course of history. Their stories, filled with triumph, tragedy, and incredible coincidence, remind us that history is ultimately a human story. They weren't marble statues. They were people who took a stand, and their legacies, both personal and political, continued to shape our world today. Thank you so much for joining me for this look into the lives of the founders. It's a powerful reminder of the human cost and enduring spirit of the American Revolution. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. We'd love to have you with us as we continue to explore the past. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Hello and welcome back. As our journey through the American Revolution concludes, we arrive at the heart of it all, the Declaration of Independence. Today, we're not just looking at a historical document. We're exploring the very soul of a nation, captured in ink and parchment, a promise that has echoed through the centuries. This is freedom's eternal flame. Let's transport ourselves back to that sweltering summer of 1776 in Philadelphia. The air was thick with tension, anticipation, and the buzz of revolutionary ideas. Inside the Pennsylvania State House, now known as Independence Hall, a group of men gathered, their shoulders burdened with the weight of a monumental decision. They were merchants, farmers, lawyers, and physicians, hailing from 13 disparate colonies, each with its own interests and fears. Yet, they were united by a common, audacious idea, the radical notion that they could govern themselves. The task of drafting the formal declaration fell to a 33-year-old Virginian, Thomas Jefferson. Tucked away in his rented rooms, with only a portable writing desk he designed himself, Jefferson began to weave words that would change the world. He was aiming to invent new principles, but to articulate the common sense of the mater, to express the shared sentiments of the American mind. He drew upon the Enlightenment philosophies of thinkers like John Locke, who had argued that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed and that individuals possess natural rights. When Jefferson presented his draft, it wasn't immediately accepted. For several days, the delegates of the Second Continental Congress debated, scrutinized, and edited his words. They were practical men, acutely aware of the life and death consequences of their actions. They knew that signing this document was an act of treason against the British Crown, a point of no return. Imagine the gravity in that room. The windows were likely kept closed to ensure secrecy, making the summer heat even more oppressive. Every sentence was weighed, every word considered. The most significant change they made was the removal of a passage condemning the slave trade, a painful compromise made to secure the unity of the southern colonies. This decision would cast a long shadow, highlighting the profound and tragic contradiction at the heart of this new nation founded on liberty. Finally, on July 4th, 1776, the final text was approved. The famous, elegant script we associate with the Declaration belongs to Timothy Met, the clerk who engrossed the official copy on parchment. The signing itself was a process that unfolded over the following weeks. Beginning in earnest on August 2nd, the first and most famous signature was that of John Hancock, the President of the Congress. He reportedly signed his name large and bold so that King George III could read it without his spectacles. Whether that's true or just a legend, his signature became a symbol of defiance and courage. Each man who stepped forward to sign knew they were pledging. As the document's final line so powerfully states, "Our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." This was no mere political statement. It was a personal vow, a pact sealed with the potential price of their own existence. But what did the Declaration actually say? Its power lies in its elegant and revolutionary structure. It begins with a preamble, a profound statement of human rights that has become one of the most famous sentences. In the English language, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Let's pause on that for a moment. This was a radical departure from the old world's divine right of kings. It posited that rights are not granted by a monarch or a government. They are inherent, belonging to every individual at birth. And the purpose of government, it argues, is to secure these rights. If a government fails to do so and becomes destructive, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. Following this powerful opening, the document presents a long list of grievances against King George III. This section acts as a legal indictment, a detailed case for the prosecution, outlining the long train of abuses and usurpations that justified the colony's separation. It lists charges like imposing taxes without consent, cutting off trade, depriving colonists of trial by jury, and quartering troops among them. This wasn't just a list of complaints. It was a carefully constructed argument designed to prove to the world that their cause was just and their actions were a last resort, not a rash rebellion. The final section is the formal Declaration of Independence itself. It's the decisive break. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. With these words, 13 British colonies ceased to exist, and in their place, a new nation, the United States of America, was willed into being. This was the moment the colonists stopped fighting for their rights as Englishmen and started fighting for their existence as an independent nation. The news of the Declaration spread like wildfire. It was read aloud in public squares, and to the Continental Army, met with cheers, celebratory cannon fire, and the ringing of bells. In New York City, an ecstatic crowd pulled down a statue of King George III. The document transformed a colonial rebellion into a war for nationhood. It provided a powerful moral and philosophical justification for the struggle, inspiring not only the soldiers in the field but also attracting crucial foreign support, most notably from France. Without the ideals articulated in the Declaration, it's hard to imagine the colonists sustaining their long and arduous fight for 7 more years. Now, as we stand here today, centuries removed from that fateful summer, what does the Declaration mean for us? It is undeniably a document of its time, written by men who, despite their lofty ideals, were flawed. The phrase, "all men are created equal," stood in stark contrast to the reality of slavery and the lack of rights for women and Native Americans. This hypocrisy has been a source of struggle and debate throughout American history. Yet, the enduring power of the Declaration lies not in a perfect reflection of its time, but in the promise it holds. It set forth an ideal, a standard against which the nation would be judged and toward which it could strive. The principles of the Declaration became a beacon for abolitionists, like Frederick Douglass for suffragettes fighting for the right to vote, and for civil rights leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who called it a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. He understood that the document's power was not in its historical context alone, but in its capacity to inspire future generations to fight for a more inclusive and just interpretation of its words. It's a living document because its ideals are constantly being debated, re-examined, and expanded upon. The struggle to live up to the promise of the Declaration is, in many ways, the ongoing story of America itself. Its influence also extends far beyond the borders of the United States. It was a catalyst for revolutionary movements across the globe. From the French Revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen to independence movements in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, people have drawn inspiration from its assertion that government should serve the people, not the other way around. It planted the seed of an idea that would grow into a global forest of self-determination and human rights. As we bring our series to a close, let us reflect on this extraordinary piece of parchment. Let's picture it, not in a climate-controlled case, but as it was in 1776, glowing under the flickering light of a candle. The ink is still fresh, the signatures bold. It is more than just a historical artifact or a list of grievances. It's a declaration of hope, a daring dream of a world where ordinary people could chart their own destiny. It's a promise of equality, liberty, and the right to pursue a life of one's own making. That promise, born in the heat of a Philadelphia summer, became an eternal flame, a guiding light for a fledgling nation and a beacon of hope for all humanity, reminding us that the pursuit of freedom is a journey that never truly ends. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. It has been an honor to explore this pivotal era with you. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. Until next time, stay curious.